Chapter 36. Mason Verger was very happy to be praised by his beloved little lamb as a good person. He even happily replied, "You are also a good and honest child." Siddle's lips curved up slightly, and she nodded. "Yes," she said cheerfully, accepting Mason's compliment without feeling guilty, "I think so too." Although this good child really wanted to physically pry his head off right now. Sigh, but she still had to restrain herself. She couldn't ruin things because of temporary happiness. The orphanage was his final destination. Siddle thought to herself and suppressed her emotions. With a calm expression, she stuck her head out and said, "Brother, I want to bring some food to the children in the orphanage, can you help me pay for it? Anyway, sooner or later this trash would have to go to the orphanage, so before that, she had to exploit him a bit, and do some good deeds for the children." Siddle had borrowed someone else's orphanage, it would be too embarrassing to go there empty-handed. Besides, she had some sympathy for the children in the orphanage. As expected, Mason agreed. At this time, the car had already gone halfway, surrounded by wild mountains and forests, winding mountain roads. Mason followed the directions for another 10 minutes before finding a small supermarket nearby. Siddle got out of the car, Mason followed her, but he did not go in but waited for her at the supermarket door. After Siddle entered, she found that the space inside was quite large, it could be called a world of her own. The shelves were arranged in rows on the shiny ceramic floor. Siddle went to the grocery counter, pushed the cart to the snack shelf. She did not like to eat snacks very much, and did not know which brands were good, so she chose expensive ones and put them in the cart. Ah! If they were children, they would definitely like to eat sweets. The little girl who did not like sweets hesitated for a moment, trying to find the silhouette of sweets on the shelves. Siddle stuffed another pile of chocolates into the cart, turned her head and saw an exquisite box of candy displayed on the highest shelf. The side of it was empty, it seemed that similar candies had already been bought. There were so few left, it must be delicious. But the shelf was very high, and Siddle had to tiptoe to try to reach the box of lemon-flavored candy that was beautifully packaged and looked very delicious. Still couldn't reach it. Siddle. She continued to try, jumped up a little and tried again. Still couldn't reach it. Siddle. Just as she was about to ask the cashier to help her take it down, a hand with a slender wrist and clear knuckles suddenly reached out from behind her and took the box of candy down. Siddle's eyes lit up. She turned around and said, "Thank you." Her words echoed in the air, finally falling to the ground. The boy in the baseball cap casually threw the candy into his cart without even looking at her. When Siddle said thank you, he had already pulled the cart away. Siddle could only see his tall and thin figure. He walked to the counter, raised his hand to push down his black baseball cap. The wolf fang zipper of his hoodie of the same color reflected a dazzling silver light under the sunlight. Siddle watched helplessly as the box of candy she liked was placed on the counter. Humph. A person who hides his head and shows his tail is definitely not a good thing. Siddle, who was still short, was angry and indignant. When she left the supermarket with a large bag of groceries, there was only Mason outside. There was no trace of anyone else, not even traces of vehicles. Seeing Siddle come out, Mason hurriedly stepped forward to help her carry the things. "You bought that much?" "Yes," Siddle smiled and handed him the things. "There are more than 100 children in the orphanage." Mason paid for Siddle and the two returned to the car. At this time, the orphanage was no more than 10 miles away. After only about 10 minutes, Siddle and Mason arrived at the orphanage. The surrounding area was not deep forests and mountains, but a vast, flat golden sand beach. The person who came out to greet them was the orphanage's director, a woman in her 50s, but her eyes were bright and soulful, her spirit was strong, she was neither self-conscious nor arrogant, and shook Mason's hand. "Thank you very much for coming here to raise money for charity. I believe that the children will make you feel all the peace and beauty here. Christy." The director waved behind him, and a young girl in her 20s ran over. She was a beautiful girl with curly brown hair and jet black eyes. "Hello, I am Christy Cotton." Christy greeted Siddle and Mason. The headmistress stood to the side and said, Christy is a volunteer here, she has been here for a month now. She will introduce everything about this orphanage to you two. You two know, it has been a long time since there has been any new investment here. No matter what, I am very grateful to you two for coming here. The headmistress sighed softly, her sorrowful eyes showing a gloomy look. Christy led the two of them into the orphanage. Siddle noticed the ruined walls around and couldn't help but feel moved. The environment here was indeed somewhat difficult to describe, it seemed to have gone through many tragic events. Entering the yard, the first thing that caught his eyes was a giant bomb. Christy looked at Mason's surprised expression, smiled, and explained to the two of them, this is a bomb dropped by the enemy during World War II. But something seems to have gone wrong and it didn't explode, remaining silent until today. About a few dozen years ago, this place was already an orphanage. Mason's expression changed slightly, then wouldn't it be very dangerous? What if it suddenly explodes one day? The smile on Christy's face froze for a moment, then she said without changing her expression, yes, according to physics, it won't explode. It's dead. The girl said softly. Siddle suddenly felt like someone was looking at her. She turned her head unconsciously, and saw a child's figure passing by behind the glass door. Is anyone on the second floor? Siddle coldly stared at the reflective window on the second floor. A gust of wind blew by, seemingly carrying a chill. Christy on this side was still leading Mason inside. Siddle thought for a moment and decided to follow Mason. No matter what, let's finish what she had to do first. If you see something that shouldn't be there, it's best to pretend not to see it. They came to a room, a place for children to rest and play. The inside was extremely spacious, about dozens of meters high. Siddle raised her head and looked, suddenly having the illusion that she was in a cave. In the empty and quiet room, there were often 2 or 3 children passing by. They were scared to look at Mason and Siddle, people they had never met before, until Christy smiled gently and waved her hand, then they dared to come forward. Siddle was observing the room, and didn't notice that Mason was missing. Facing Siddle's question, Christy smiled and said, Brother Verger just said he wanted to go for a walk alone so he left first, I don't know where he is now. Siddle's expression didn't change, but she felt a little worried. She didn't know if that guy had gone somewhere to find a suitable child. She was a little depressed, said goodbye to Christy and ran out. She had to go find out where Mason was. After Siddle left the room, Christy lowered her head and spoke gently to the group of children surrounding her. No one saw, beside a certain bed, a series of wet footprints of children suddenly appeared. On the transparent glass window, a pale face with pitch-black eyes could be seen looking out the window. Mason Verger felt that little Siddle was his lucky star. Not only was she very much to his taste, but because he went to the orphanage with her, he also discovered a rare lamb. It was a boy wearing old, tattered clothes. The clothes on his body were dirty as if they hadn't been washed for decades. His lower body was almost naked, revealing his slender, gray-white legs. Mason swore that, for a few short seconds, he saw the feeling of brokenness on that child's body, the thing that had always fascinated him. However, in just a few seconds, the child ran away without a trace. Mason didn't see him in the hall anymore. He was disappointed, then thought that perhaps this child had a terrible life in the orphanage. If he could find and coax him, he might be able to trick him directly back to Muskrat Farm, without even having to argue with that old headmistress. He knew better than anyone, how many people in the name of volunteering with charity but doing dirty things. What if the headmistress demanded a price increase on the spot? Mason snorted viciously and thought. There were only a few dozen adopted children here. Just now in the main hall there were only about a dozen. However, Mason walked straight from the hall to the kitchen, then from the kitchen to the backyard, still not finding the boy in the gray blood clothes. He was a little angry and cursed under his breath. Mason was not a good-natured person from the beginning. The gentleness he showed on the outside was just a deceptive tool to achieve his goals. Just when Mason thought he couldn't find it and was about to go back to ask Christy or the headmistress, he turned his head and suddenly caught a glimpse of a gray figure through the crack in the door opposite. The boy, covered in gray from head to toe, squatted behind the gap between the iron-locked doors, half of his face covered by the lock, revealing only a pair of eyes that stared at him silently. Mason's eyes lit up, his heart filled with joy. The gap between the two doors was not small enough for a child to fit through. However, when he got closer, he found that not only had the child run away, but his body was also very difficult to get through. Mason could only squat down, trying to poke his head inside, and found that this place was a room with the same structure as the main hall, only much smaller. In the room covered in a thick layer of dust, Mason kept calling out, "Hey boy, where are you? I'm the charity Mason Verger. I'm here to adopt a child this time. My farm is very big, there are lots of new clothes, toys, delicious food, you can even go horse riding there." He waited outside the door to coax for a long time, but there was no movement inside. Mason talked until his throat was dry. He was angry again. He pulled the wooden door open hard. Unexpectedly the gap was widened by a few centimeters. Mason was happy, tried to squeeze in, and actually succeeded. He coughed violently because of the dust. He waved the air in front of him in disgust, then slowly stood up. Looking around, Mason found the entrance to a corridor. He walked towards it, calling out to the unknown child as he walked. "Hey, I promise to treat the adopted children well. You know, my father is a famous tycoon." As he spoke, he walked up the stairs at the turn to the second floor. Mason didn't expect there to be such a large space here. He looked around aimlessly, originally not thinking that he would find anything, but as a result, without paying attention, he caught a glimpse of a gray-white child standing at the end of the second-floor corridor. Mason was overjoyed and took a few steps forward, intending to introduce himself and then coax him again, when he suddenly saw the child turn around. His sleeves were tied tightly in front of him, barefoot, quietly looking at him. On his gray-white skin stood out a pair of cold, gloomy eyes, full of a malicious aura. Mason suddenly froze. He stood there in fear, his legs trembling, unconsciously taking a step back. Mason suddenly understood why he saw the feeling of being crushed on this child. Because his head was really crushed. Like a watermelon with its skin peeled off, revealing the bright red flesh inside. On the child's round skull, there was a hole that was bleeding. The skin next to the bleeding hole was cracked, like a dense spider web, wrapped from the top of the head to the eyebrow bone. That hole was still squirting blood like rain. Mason continuously took a few steps back, his lips trembling non-stop, scared to the point of being dumbfounded, just staring blankly at the child with the bleeding head slowly walking towards him.